I tell you what,
It's not like the olden days.
I'm Rosie.
I'm Jake.
And today we're talking to you about The Fly, which is quite a lot of films, really. Lately we've watched the 1958 original and the 1986 remake with Jeff Goldblum, which is the one that we grew up watching, even though it's an 18. We watched it as children. And The Fly 2, the 89 sequel to that one. And we also read about the sequels to the original, The Fly, the second of which is on YouTube, but neither of us really fancied watching that, and we didn't have the opportunity to watch The Return of the Fly without buying a DVD, which wasn't worth it. It was the 1986 version that made me want to podcast about it, because, as I said, that was part of my childhood, although it is quite horrific and disturbing, and it's got quite a bit of sex, too.
I was watching a quick video on YouTube about some background information on the 1986 version of The Fly, and it was saying how they weren't quite sure what direction to go with it until this director was brought in who was famed for, had a penchant for body horror. And you can quite see how that has been incorporated into the movie as one of the very main aspects, and it is quite disgusting and horrific, whatever age you are, but fortunately it's other things as well.
Your top recommendation, what not to eat whilst watching it, is custard, isn't it?
That's right. But really, it's not a film to have a meal with if you want to enjoy your meal, because of all the various bits of bodies changing, morphing, falling off, becoming very weird and secreting various substances.
I think that's what I liked as a child. And we were saying, weren't we, the strength of it isn't character. It has Jeff Goldblum's Dr. Seth Brundle, who is the scientist who genetically splices himself with a fly by accident. Gina Davis as Veronica, or Ronnie, who is the journalist following Seth's journey with his experiments / love interest. And then the other primary character, or maybe he would qualify as secondary, is Stathis, which is such a stupid name, and his second name's even stupider.
Borans. Just random collections of letters, both of them.
Who fulfills every other role that the story needs, with the exception of the guy who gets his arm broken whilst arm wrestling and the girl that Seth brings home afterwards.
Yes, it's very true you're pointing that out. We were watching it the other week, how he is every other character in the film. He's her boss, Ronnie's boss, also her ex-boyfriend, also her support network later in the film, and the guy who can get you an abortion in the middle of the night at 2 minutes' notice. And in the original cut, as we've discovered, he was also her future boyfriend, partner. They're back together in bed together at the end of the movie. And what a wise decision that was, not to include that ending of the movie, because it would make Ronnie seem very weak, very much needing a man, the best man available at the time, and no matter how much of a dick and an inappropriate coming into your apartment without you knowing you've been so far, it doesn't matter as long as you're there for her in the end.
And all of them don't really have any sense of character beyond what's required for the story. They don't have any hobbies or phobias, or they don't like animals or anything. They just do what they need to do. But that's okay, because you just really want to see Jeff Goldblum turn into a fly, don't you? And I can't think of much more to say about it, except in terms of comparing it to the 1958 original. I don't know about you. And that's the one I think that gets kind of referenced and is in the soup and gets parodied. Certainly on The Simpsons, we can all visualise Bart with the fly head and the fly arm, and then the fly with Bart's head on the spider's web later on. And it's interesting because the science is different. The story is kind of basically the same. The scientist invents what Seth calls telepods. I can't remember what Andre calls them. He calls them something silly, actually, doesn't he?
He doesn't get any further than calling them disintegrator reintegrators. which is much too long.
Yes, you need something snappier and something that involves the idea of teleportation rather than just the disintegration reintegration process.
Yes, they've got telephone and television. Teleport is the next stage, and Andre should have thought of that.
But, as I was saying, the science is different. He has to write down to explain to his wife, does Andre, that our atoms got mixed up when he was accidentally in the disintegrator reintegrator with this fly. Whereas, by 1986, we knew a bit about genetics, and as Seth's computer explained to us, it fused Seth with the fly on molecular genetic level, and Jeff Goldblum does a good reaction to reading that off the screen, doesn't he? What did you say? That's never what you want to see.
It was kind of worse than anything he thought might pop up when he'd been trying to get the computer to tell him what happened. And yes, the reaction was certainly justified. We were discussing how perhaps that was a bit of motivation to remake the film, how they knew more about how genetics work and how two creatures might be mixed together on a molecular genetic level. And it's certainly an idea very in keeping with current science facts to make a science fiction movie about. It's interesting, in that first movie, Ronnie's saying how the teleporters are going to make things like aeroplanes obsolete. They're going to change transport. But then by sequel, Fly 2, what they're apparently interested in is the teleporter's potential as a genetic engineering piece of equipment. Get you in there, cut out your cancer or your heart disease or whatever, and put you in the second teleport without it, which is an interesting development.
And in 1958, they want to transport food to where it's needed most, which is a very laudable ambition. And this brings me on to how the ideology is different. Not just of what they want to do with the teleporter, but also the fact that Andre is married. He has a family. He has a wife who I mentioned, her name is Elaine, and a son called Philippe. And by the way, I wondered why they had French names, so I read that the film is set in Canada, and the idea is based on a short story by a French writer.
And then the 1958 Fly begins, and it says on the building where he works, Montreal something, and we go, right, it was there all the time.
And the reason I bother mentioning how Andre is married and has a family is because it's just quite interesting to think that that's how they make us care. That's how they make him a respectable scientist who we don't want to get fused with a fly. Although I kind of did, that's the whole point in watching the film. In all these sitcoms, which aren't from the 50s, the ones I'm thinking of, they're from the 70s. Some others do have them. Fawlty Towers, Butterflies. The characters are married. They're living the kind of life that you're supposed to live to be socially acceptable. So that's quite interesting to me. And another thing that's different is the style of filmmaking and storytelling. We don't see Andre getting into the disintegrator, reintegrator with the fly. We see him after it's happened with a tea towel or something on his head and his hand in his coat pocket, writing or typing messages for Elaine. And it's gradually revealed, first the hand and then the head, at which point Elaine screams and runs out of the lab, and I'm like, well, what was she expecting? It's obvious that's what happened. And in the trailer too, you get Vincent Price, who we haven't mentioned, saying, what did that girl see to make her scream, and going on about a scientist who dared to play God, which we might come back to in a moment. But before that, I'll just finish making this point about the trailers. We don't get to see what on earth could have happened. We just get this teaser of ideas, whereas in the trailer for The Fly, and The Fly 2 as well, I think, of the 80s, you get to see all the kind of horrific goo and body horror and practically the whole film, really. And I think in terms of how much you show in the trailer, they were much better at it in the 50s and the 60s and the 30s. Make us wait till we get to the cinema, and then you get some good surprises.
Yes, it is an interesting point, that playing God thing. It's what people say when science reaches a point that they personally aren't comfortable with. Like the doctors on Neighbours saying that putting Libby's baby in Susan was playing God. And we're like, we don't want to play God, why are you a doctor? It's the very personal judgment of where that line is. And Andre had a very good response to that in the 1958 Fly, which went along the lines of God gives us intelligence so we can make scientific advancements for the good of humanity, and he's absolutely right.
When we were watching the trailer before we saw the film, it's a special feature on that DVD to film thing, isn't it? The trailer for the original The Fly. We're saying, why is Vincent Price talking about him playing God? God doesn't do teleportation. Playing God is stuff like abortion and euthanasia and stuff to do with life and death. That's silly, we said. When they actually talk about it in the film, in the narrative, it makes more sense because they're talking about experimenting on animals, which is mucking about with life and death. And I do actually lose all sympathy for Andre. I don't care how married he is, how much his family love him. When he puts the cat through the disintegrator, reintegrator, without having tested it on anything else alive, he's like, oh yeah, it'll work now, sticks the cat in. And the cat just sort of disappears, it never reintegrates. And perhaps now we can talk about the scene that clearly inspired with Jeff Goldblum and Gina Davis, the baboon.
Yes, we were discussing while watching all the films how there should be a sequence of what you try out in the telepods. It goes something like inanimate objects, then inanimate objects with complex working parts like the telephone that Martin tests in the second film, second 80s film.
Stocking, telephone.
Very good idea of him to do that. Then you get something like the apple, the cactus, if it'll do plant matter, then a steak, taste the steak. See if it tastes synthetic. Then you might move on to small animals when it obviously is able to transport living things. But nope, it hardly ever happens the correct way. Straight for the cat, or in Jeff Goldblum's case, straight for the baboon. We use the steak later.
When I was a child, even though I like animals, I was quite comfortable that none of it was real. It was just a horrific movie. So I quite enjoyed the bit where they turn the baboon inside out. If that was real, I wouldn't like it at all. But there it is, sort of splattered on the floor of Pod 2, still moving. I think it probably died really quite quickly after that. I don't know if it's time to talk about the scene with the dog in The Fly 2 yet, but that clearly influenced it, and that one I care very much, and it doesn't feel like it's just a movie. But what you were saying about the progression that you should take before you get onto an animal reminded me how in The Fly 2, the evil scientists, or the over-ambitious, soulless, tunnel vision scientists are trying to run before they can walk. They're doing it to animals, to golden retrievers, before they've even done it to a telephone or any other inanimate object. And it's them trying to run before they can walk, being impatient, wanting to get the invention ready for what they want to do with it, but not wanting to bother with the stages of getting it there.
He really does come across as the ultimate mad scientist / rich bureaucrat towards the end, doesn't he, Mr. Bartok, when he's saying he really wants to use the telepods to control all life on Earth.
Yeah, that's kind of playing God, isn't it?
It is, rather, and that's why they were really interested in getting them to work. As we were discussing, yes, with the turning the baboon inside out business, it doesn't really return a viable organism for you. But with the dog thing in The Fly too, it was slightly different. It doesn't really turn it inside out. It just makes it all weird, and it can actually continue to live for 3 years, even though it really shouldn't be made to. And that's a whole other type of horror in a couple of different ways. So yes, it's very affecting.
Unlike his predecessors, Martin actually has some character. He is precocious and annoying to the scientists looking after him as one thing. And another thing is that he likes animals, particularly dogs, and he forms a relationship with this beautiful golden retriever. Obviously no one watching wants that to come to any harm. And in the original draft, or an original draft, an earlier draft, that character who got made weird in the telepod was going to be a human who Martin liked, wasn't it? And there are a couple of reasons why that was a bad decision and they were right to change it to a dog. One of which is, who cares about humans? It's a dog that you don't want to see being horrifically maimed and kept alive in terrible agony for 3 years. And another one is that any human that this happens to will have given informed consent. so it's much more evil and much more distressing to do it to this trusting, innocent animal that has absolutely no idea what's going on. And then in the end, Martin finds out that they've been keeping this dog thing alive and feeding it this sort of slop through a cat flap in a kind of observation area, and people go and look at it and go, oh, it's so weird. And he goes down and chloroforms it, and the bit where I really start to tear up is where the dog recognises him and starts thumping its tail on the ground. And you can really then reconcile the creature that they made for the film so that they've got something to show us, even though it's not the dog itself, with the golden retriever. And I really believe, even I know it's not true, but watching the film, I believe that they're the same character. It absolutely breaks my heart. And then Martin chloroforms him and cries. And we haven't mentioned any actors in this film yet, have we? He is Eric Stoltz, who 4 years previously had filmed a couple of scenes from Back to the Future, as I'm sure we discussed before they said, oh, it's no good, we're going to have to get Michael J. Fox at all costs. But Martin Brundle really is the role Eric Stoltz was born to play. Okay, he looks a bit like Crispin Glover, I always think that watching Fly 2. That doesn't make him a good Marty, and doesn't make him a good Martin either, but everything else about his performance is absolutely spot on. Other things we've seen him in include Little Women and Pulp Fiction, and he's only kind of okay in those, isn't he? And he doesn't have major roles. But The Fly 2, that's his movie.
A tough decision to make that character that Martin cares about a dog, but definitely the right one artistically. Of course, in deciding that there wasn't going to be a person that Martin liked, they made all characters in The Fly 2 that Martin interacts with, except for Beth, absolutely soulless and evil. I was a little surprised when I watched it when I was young that there wasn't one doctor who was quite nice to Martin and thought of Martin as a person rather than an experiment, and Martin got on okay with. I thought maybe Dr. Shepherd was going to be that character, but no. So you can quite see why Martin, the Fly version of Martin, has no fondness for any of these people and kills them all, because they all darn well deserve it.
When he turns into a fly at the end and goes on the rampage, by the way, I'll just say this now, he's more of a fly than you might expect for someone who's 25% fly, isn't he?
He's the kind of giant fly effect I was really hoping for and didn't get in the first movie. I wanted exactly to see that giant fly rushing around causing havoc. And even better, it turns out he's got Martin's mind to quite some extent.
He doesn't kill, in fact, he pets the security Rottweiler they send after him. And you think, oh yes, when he's going to kill everyone later, it's because they're all dicks to him. I think it spoils it slightly when he kills these two security guards who've really never done anything to upset him. They don't deserve to die.
He does have the savagery of the insect as well. Otherwise, yeah, the whole thing wouldn't work. He probably wouldn't quite go so far as sacrificing Mr. Bartok to save himself if he had his own human mind completely. So it all worked out for the best, really, in the end.
I always say, don't I don't think flies are actually that savage, that brutal. It's just something they say for these movies.
Yes, indeed. It's in all of them how the savage mind of the fly is going to take over in the old ones, and Jeff Goldblum in the new one does the whole thing about insect politics. He'd like to be the first insect politician, but he doesn't think he can. I mean, obviously you have to go that way in these horror movies, because when you turn into a fly, you've got to be a monster, otherwise it's not a monster movie. And even Martin has got to have those monstrous aspects to it.
I'd like to just say a little bit more about Beth, as she's been mentioned. These movies are kind of written by men, and they don't really know what to do with women, aren't they? Gina Davis turned down the role in The Fly 2, I think. I don't know what it would have been, but it sounds like it wasn't going to be much good, much of a continuation of Ronnie's story. So they got someone who looks as much like Gina Davis as anyone can, especially when you take off her oxygen mask and you you see her lip, it's a distinctive mouth, to give birth to Martin and then die. And in The Return of the Fly from 1959, wasn't it, the very next year,
I think so.
Elaine has completely vanished, and Philippe, the son from the first movie, The Fly, in the second movie, has a love interest, and Martin has a love interest who is Beth. And I think she has, to be fair, more character than if she'd been in the first film, because she likes fly fishing, she's frustrated that she's not being moved up the career ladder at Bartok Industries. She's some sort of systems programmer, I think. So she's got some character. Mainly she's the love interest, the person who gets filmed having sex with Martin to start tipping him over the edge because he thought he had privacy at last, and his support network.
As I understand it about Gina Davis, she did turn down The Fly too. There was a more extensive role for the character of Ronnie in the film, but she was going to die at some point, and Gina Davis was quite right to turn it down. I do think it's a bit of a shame. I was saying they could have kept her, used her. She could have been like Dumbo's mum. She's kind of being held captive by the evil people, and she's the prize at the end when Martin sorts everything out. He gets to free his mother and be reunited with his mother, just like Dumbo. And he could have had Beth as well, and that would have been rather nice. But yes, you can see why, for the sake of making the second movie, they couldn't really have his mum, Ronnie, around a lot, and they would have been quite happy to have the character not involved at all, because Martin is seen as an experiment by everyone he interacts with, apart from Beth. And obviously if his mother's around, that's not going to be happening, is it? I always enjoyed the inclusion of Stathis in the second movie. John Getz, the actor, returning there from the first film. He's obviously been given a big payoff to buy a Jeep and a big house and lots of alcohol, and he's taken it. And perhaps we get to see, towards the end, remnants of whatever humanity he had poking through. And I was saying they should have made a third film, shouldn't they, like with the original trilogy. The Fly 3, everything's okay now. Martin and Beth are quite happily settled. No more fly genes. The teleporters are working and starting to be used for good in the world. Stathis rediscovers whatever was left of his humanity. And I think we can very much reasonably think that that's the path the characters are going down after the second movie. So that's certainly a good thing about it. Where the first movie leaves you thinking, oh dear, nothing about this situation is good. It's certainly not the case in the second movie. But I was saying at the end of the first movie, she really needs to go and get that baby out of her now. The doctor doesn't know why she's disappeared from his office and the window's all smashed in the middle of the night. Perhaps he's still there waiting to do the abortion. She should really go and have it based on everything that's just happened and what's likely to happen in the future. But no, of course, for the future of the franchise, she can't do that.
The reason they would like us to believe is that she wants to hold on to what's left of Seth. He's smashed the window and taken her away from the abortion clinic so that he can plead with her, don't kill what's left of me. She's very upset when he has to be put down with Stathis' shotgun at the end. So if you ask, they'd say, well, that's why she couldn't bring herself to have an abortion. Of course, Stathis is there at the beginning of The Fly too. I thought that was quite effective. There he is, witnessing the labour and saying, oh no, she's in trouble, why don't you help her, and all that kind of thing. And then he kind of vanishes, and we see him again being a recluse before he even knows who it is knocking on the door. He tells them to go away. And when we watched it recently, I was comparing him to Snape, wasn't I, of Harry Potter. You can see that his hatred of Seth is very much at the surface. He tells the events of the first movie very much from his perspective, puts his spin on it, stole my girl. And it finishes up with, dissolved my hand and my foot. I have no love for the man, which is quite amusing, and that's true. He did do that, dissolve Stephen's hand and his foot. And then, towards the end of the scene, he starts to say, if you found the answer, kid, use it. And after Martin's gone, he's telling Beth, talks some sense into him, so you can see that his love for Ronnie is also there, and both those feelings from both parents are projected onto the child, just like Snape with Harry Potter.
That was certainly an interesting comparison we hadn't thought of before. And unlike Snape, hopefully Stathis has some chance for future happiness. When you were talking about how Andre is family man to make him respectable, I was thinking about the comparison with how they do Seth as the kind of weird, reclusive, eccentric scientist. And in the 80s, he doesn't need to be a family man for that. He can start off in that role and get to know Ronnie and fall in love with her, and will care about them in that way, which is different type of filmmaking, as you were saying, from in the 50s.
That's how they were doing it by then, wasn't it? You meet someone and fall in love throughout the course of the movie, even if it is a sci-fi, not a romance. Just like Doc with Clara in Back to the Future 3.
Of course, self-experimentation is something that mad scientists are famous for, or certainly over-eager scientists. And I was wondering if the aspect with Seth of him being a bit weird, a bit of a loner, a bit of a recluse was meant to make us think, oh, he's a bit of a mad scientist. No wonder he's going through the telepods too early. Of course, he was having bitchy, jealous feelings about Ronnie and Stathis when he went through too early, wasn't he? So there's more to it.
Confiding in the baboon that they did put through successfully, and he says to him, oh, you're okay, I'm going to get in the pods without waiting for your test results. And I always say, well, the test results wouldn't have told him what would go wrong anyway, because the baboon went through on his own. I think, just as a point of interest, Dr. Jekyll probably was the original scientist who experimented on himself. I certainly can't think of one that precedes him.
And is he supposed to be respectable as one would be at the time? I mean, he's not married, is he? But he has a very respectable job and is a respectable gentleman.
Yes, we could talk for hours about that if we were doing Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde about Victorian repression. The book is all about how some of everyone's respectability isn't real, it's just to suppress your desires and all that kind of thing. I don't think they were going for that in The Fly. It's an idea that's evolved from there and sort of gone off on a tangent. The scientist who experiments on himself, it's always a him. But thinking about genetics as well, I was saying to you, wasn't I, when they put the steak through and it tastes synthetic and it's the computer's version of a steak, I was saying, is that the point at which Seth taught it about genetics? You can see that if it just got the atoms, like Andre was on about, it might just put them back together in a different way. And if it's a stocking, whatever percent nylon and all that the computer tells us that it is, it wouldn't matter. But with something living or organic, then it would matter. And the answer to that is genetics. The atoms and the biological makeup fit together in this one specific way.
And that certainly does work with what the computer decides to do when it finds Seth and the Fly in there. It thinks there's one organism in there. It's been taught about molecular genetics, so it puts every bit of living thing inside back together as one organism from the molecular genetic perspective, and makes perfect sense, as I say, as a piece of sci-fi.
Another difference, of course, with the 1958 movie is that change in Seth is gradual. And it's a difference in horror and what gets people as well. By 1986, we're pretty much desensitized to someone just suddenly having a fly head and a fly hand, aren't we? And I was saying to you when we watched it, perhaps if you've seen the original Fly and you're waiting for the mist to clear as Seth comes out of the pod, you're expecting him to be different already. And he seems exactly the same, and then things change gradually. As I said, he's growing a few hairs out of some cuts in his back. He's little by little getting kind of blotchy in the face. He's discovering that he has super strength. And then after some time you get to the stage where his fingernails are falling off until he's no longer Jeff Goldblum right at the end. Whereas with Andre, as everyone knows, he's just got this fly head and this fly hand. And that's quite interesting, I think, because it reflects the change in what we know about science, and it reflects the change in movie making and how to get at people's fears.
Seth is absolutely right. How does Brundlefly eat is very educational. It convinced me why it's a bad idea to eat food if you've seen flies land on it. I didn't realise they'd actually vomited on it to suck it back up. I don't think they really appreciated how the fly was supposed to feed, did they, in the 58 version? He was kind of sucking up his milk and brandy. He was also eating this meat, wasn't he, very much as a person eats.
I think in real life, flies don't want alcohol to drink, do they? And the tarty girl from the arm wrestling bar place is rubbing alcohol onto Seth, and he's going, don't do that, it hurts. Another comparison, of course, is the ending. The woman who loves him has to put him down. I talked about how Ronnie has to blow his brains out with a shotgun, as Stathis puts it in The Fly 2. The 1958 Fly has this non-linear narrative where we find out, first of all, that Elaine has crushed her husband's head and hand in this hydraulic press. I sometimes wonder what they do with it. It's got a direct route to and from his lab. It's part of the business that these two brothers run. Vincent Price, who plays Francois, which I don't think we've mentioned, and Andre. And I said, well, maybe he makes stuff for his experiments with that. And I don't know what Francois does with it, if he makes cars or anything. That's what's happened to Andre in the end anyway, and the rest of the film, or most of the rest of the film, is Francois extracting the story from Elaine about why she's killed her husband with a hydraulic press.
And of course, because she's only a woman, and she's terribly weak, and we have to get the truth out of the damn girl, it's perfectly alright to lie to her. Yes, I have the fly, and things like that. I think the ideal's rather outdated, as indeed is to be expected in these old things.
Of course, that ending is quite iconic, isn't it? Where Vincent Price and some other guy are looking at the web and the fly human head thing is going, help me, and the spider's coming to eat it. I always think, kill the spider or the fly. If you want to save the fly and let it get on with its life, kill the spider. If you want to kill the fly because they've been saying, oh, we must kill the fly, even though it's harmless. I don't know why they needed to do that. But no, they kill both of them.
Yes, the police chief, that other character. So, of course, he and Vincent Price can concoct the cover story so the woman doesn't get put away as insane. After hearing that story, she won't hang.
And then from this, having seen The Fly from 1958, The Fly from 1986, and The Fly 2, we were speculating that in The Return of the Fly, we get a happy ending because Andre and Seth have comparable endings. Perhaps Martin and Philippe do as well. In the 1958 Fly, everyone's going around trying to trap the white-headed fly, and Philippe actually manages to trap it twice, and the Marmelade either makes him let it go because she doesn't realise, or just lets it escape because she's no good at trapping flies.
Oh, yes. Oh, she deserves all the lying to and being put away that she was potentially going to get at. She's awfully stupid. He even, yes, retraps it for her in his little net, Philippe, and she lets it out the window.
So, we know that there is a solution, and we were both thinking, and one of us was saying, and the other one was agreeing, probably in The Return of the Fly they managed to get Philippe Fly and put them back through the disintegrator, reintegrator, and everything's fine, just like they're able to get all the good DNA out of Bardock and all the bad DNA out of Martin and turn Bardock into a blubbering monster thing and Martin back to normal. Sad ending, happy ending. And reading about it, that's absolutely right. We've seen the trailer for The Return of the Fly. It says, oh, look at all these weird experiments. Rat-man with paws instead of hands and feet. And there's a living corpse as well. And we were saying, what, does Philippe just put animals and people through the teleporter? Why? And if you read about it, there is actually quite a reasonable explanation for what happens.
They're trying to use it for transportation, aren't they? And certain things get disintegrated and stored, and then there's some sort of evil saboteur who comes and puts them back together wrong, including Philippe and the Fly.
I might be interested to see that one day, but it's not on YouTube. I don't fancy paying for it, so maybe I'll never get to see it. It sounds quite interesting. Whereas The Curse of the Fly is on YouTube, but it sounds really stupid. I don't think there's even a fly in it. But also, some ideas from that made it into the 1980s duo. It's got sons of Philippe who have got residual fly DNA in them, which makes no sense, but oh well. And one of them is called Martin, and one of them, or both of them, have premature aging because of this residual fly DNA, and that's what Martin Brundle has in the Fly too. And I was saying, oh, it's always lazy whenever anyone's got accelerated aging, and it actually is, because they need Martin to be an adult for the film, but he's only 5 years old. It is kind of lazy, but it's also something that they took from the original Fly trilogy.
They've got in that one, the two brothers, the grandsons of the original Andre the Fly, this kind of teleporting around the world business with telepods in different cities over the world, haven't they? Which should be a good development. But when you were telling me all about The Curse of the Fly, I thought, well, that's a much worse ending to the whole thing than The Return of the Fly. A much more bleak ending. It means that Andre going in with the fly has ultimately led to the destruction of his entire family because of those recessive fly genes. The problem he started there that was never really fully sorted, and thus the two characters are both dead. Whereas the Return of the Fly ending, like the Fly 2 ending, is better, is hopeful. The son has the same experience, similar experience, and comes out of it okay, and ultimately the whole situation, as started in the first movie, is okay. It has a happy ending. It's an adventure, it's perilous, but you can come away thinking, well, that's not so bad then. And coming back for a third film and chucking all that out the window and saying, actually, it's cursed the family forever and they're all dead now, I don't like that. Rather a lazy way, really, to get back into it and do more genetic modification and teleporting stuff. And perhaps Vincent Price thought so too, and that's why he's not in it as old great-uncle Francois.
Yes, of course, he is in The Return of the Fly. There's quite an amusing bit in the trailer where he's saying, what if we can't get Philippe back to normal? And whoever he's talking to says in a very posh English accent, then he will have to be destroyed. And I thought, they're trying to get us with, it happened to Andre, didn't it? Now it's going to happen to Philippe too. And that was one of the things that made me think, I bet they managed to sort it out. I bet he won't have to be destroyed. Just like Martin.
So yeah, you completely undo that by coming back with a third movie where the whole family line has to be destroyed anyway.
I don't think they put much thought into it. The next two were churned out very quickly, and they obviously had less budget. You can tell because they're in black and white, whereas the Fly is in colour. And maybe they put some thought into the second one, and Vincent Price was on board with it, and he's in it. And then by the time they got to the third one, they were just horror, horror, horror. People want horrific, terrible, dark things from this franchise, and they never made any more after that, so perhaps people really wanted more.
Of course, the very best bit of the 1958 Fly is where Police Chief suddenly says to Vincent Price, out of nowhere, about Andre's wife,
Elaine.
"You're in love with her, aren't you?" And he goes, "Yes." And we're like, really? I haven't really got that so far. So it's certainly a happy ending for the first movie for Vincent Price, because of course he has ready-made wife and son. It's his nephew, technically. But it's everything he ever wanted, and of business as well. So a happy ending for him, and perhaps he was pleased to come back and make a happy ending for the Fly aspect of the whole thing as well, and that's why he is in The Return of the Fly. I do think they should mention his mother. Philippe's mother, Vincent Price's wife now in there.
Perhaps they do mention her. She's just not in any of the stuff that you can read.
Hopefully she didn't die while we weren't looking. It's supposed to be like 20 years later or something. They can say anything's happened to her, can't they?
Perhaps they said she's in the loony bin after all because the whole experience drove her mad as she was only a woman in the 50s. One thing I forgot to mention earlier was the kitten in The Fly too. I always found that very striking, particularly the first time. There's this sweet little ginger kitten who Martin shows to Beth, and then he's like, we're going to put it through the telepod. And she's going, Martin, no. And he says, trust me. And I remember thinking, I do trust you, Martin. I know you're not going to turn that sweet little kitten inside out. I know you've got the telepods working. And of course, it's true. And it would have been too much if he'd opened up the telepod and gone, oh no, whoopsie, the kitten's inside out. Then you wouldn't still be behind him. You would know that it's a bad decision by the movie makers artistically, and Beth wouldn't trust him and love him anymore either. So that's a very striking scene. And the cat that the kitten will grow into has a place in our Everything's Fine Now sequel, doesn't it?
That's right, because we know Beth takes it to live on her houseboat with her, and you can see in the original ending on the DVD, which you can work out is going to be the ending anyway, that she also has Martin to live with her on her her houseboat, and she brings him lunch, and he's perfectly fine.
Isn't there some hint there's still a bit of fly in him? That's why they decided to scrap it, I think, isn't it? Because that's so stupid. You want the happy ending to be definitely happy.
Yes, he's got the contact lens in or something. Yeah, so in some ways it would have been quite nice to see him with his clothes back on, having a meal instead of all that mung all over him. But we don't want an ambiguous ending. He and Beth and the cat live happily on the houseboat and do great things in the telepod business.
Which means that the actual ending is what's left of Mr. Bartok and what's been added to Mr. Bartok being in that same observation unit thing that the poor dog was in earlier. And sometimes we say Superman wouldn't approve of that, He-Man wouldn't approve of that. Martin is kind of, well, maybe he's not directly responsible, but he certainly hasn't stopped it, so he's meted out his own justice there. Instead of putting Mr. Bartok down, he's given him this ironic punishment where he has to live as a sort of blob.
Yeah, I like a protagonist who'll do something like that to get back at a complete bastard, and that's what happens there.
Bartok certainly deserves it. If it wasn't for the dog, I might say he didn't deserve it, but that happened with the dog, so he does deserve it.
Yes, and of course they want you to keep guessing for a while about Bartok in the movie. How evil, how ruthless is he? How much does he feel for Martin? I want you to think of me as your dad. Here's your own private place. But as it turns out, everything Bartok has ever said to Martin is a manipulative lie, like a lot of fathers, really. And so, yeah, his journey and where it ends is certainly very justified, I think.
We were saying, weren't we, most fathers aren't actually waiting for you to turn into a fly. Why did this to happen? But there's always something like that, or often something like that, isn't there?
Talk to me when you doctor, sort of. That's reminded me how effective the scene is where he's getting the computer to tell him, well, what will happen to this donor who's going to give me good cells if I go through with them. And it makes this picture of what the donor person's going to look like. And it says underneath, non-viable.
You think, I'd like to see that. And you kind of know you're going to see it later.
Martin at that point is like, whoa, I can't do that. I can't do that. It's not something I can use. But it takes the absolute evil of his father figure and his savage mind of the insect when he's the fly to actually make it happen. Thank God it does happen.
Very understandable decision there.
And on that note, another very interesting podcast comes to an end. Do join us again next time, which will be the final Sunday in December, for a podcast on a TV series again. After a couple of movie podcasts in a row, we're back to the BBC and Jonathan Creek. So until then,
good night out there.
Whatever you are.